Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Chip. Yeah, so as Chip mentioned, my name is Anne Toomey. I'm at Pace University, and I'm based in New York City. And today I'm going to talk about why facts don't change minds and what does. And so this, may bring up also, I do notice that we are currently in an interesting moment, right, in our country. So some of what I might talk about also might be relevant in today's other things that are happening in the world. So I just also want to thank Julia and Chip who invited me here today. And as Chip mentioned, I first met Julia last year when I reached out to her to request an interview for the book that Chip mentioned, Science with Impact, to learn more specifically about the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council's Citizen Science Program. Okay, so before I get into the talk, I want to take a minute and just hear a little bit from all of you about where you're coming from. So please, if you can take a moment and post in the chat if you've had an experience trying to share scientific or other facts and if you've had them rebuffed or ignored. So just take a minute, and folks want to post. I know I'm not quite used to this interface yet, but hopefully I'll be able to see the chat. So I think I see things coming up in the question panel.
I think that's where they're going, is in the question panel.
Okay. So I'm not sure how to open it, unfortunately. Oh, okay. Oh, I see people saying, yes, for sure. I've had these experiences pretty much daily in fisheries management. In North Carolina, we've had problems getting recreational fishermen to believe that they do impact fish stocks. In fisheries, a lot. Yes, especially when scientific information conflicts with personal observations of fishermen. Discussing climate change with friends, great, we'll talk about that. We've had a lot of challenges communicating the science of our management activities for Atlantic menhaden and horseshoe crab. All right, great. So you can keep posting and I'll be able to check these in a little bit. I'm just gonna move on. Okay, so the way I'm gonna give this talk today is I'm gonna be telling 3 stories. The first story, where I'll try to unpack why facts don't change minds, is about a place called Tangier Island in Virginia, which some of you may know. It's a place that's threatened by sea level rise, but where there's a lot of skepticism about climate change and sea level rise. So we'll explore this case study to have a better understanding of how factual information is processed in the brain and why humans, all humans, have trouble accommodating new information that challenges pre-existing beliefs. The second story comes to us from India, and it's a terrific success story of how civil society was mobilized to eradicate polio. Here we'll explore network science and how behavior spreads and leads to social change. And the third story will rethink and expand the roles of scientists in stakeholder engagement, policy, and communication. This is a story that comes to us from Pennsylvania, and it's of how a professor of entomology and a student helped to change farming practice and policy in rural Pennsylvania. And I first learned of this story actually from doing interviews with farmers for my book, who highlighted this professor and his work. Okay, so the first story is we're going to talk about Tangier Island. So for those of you who may not know, Tangier is an island off the eastern coast of the United States, and it's part of the state of Virginia. Since 1850, 2/3 of Tangier's landmass have disappeared, largely due to erosion, which is driven by sea level rise and increasing storms. Scientists predict that the island will be uninhabitable uninhabitable within the next few decades. And if this happens, the residents of Tangier will be among the first climate refugees in the United States, which is a label more associated with island communities in the South Pacific. However, unlike communities in the South Pacific who've often been at the front lines of the fight for climate action on the international level, the residents of Tangier have not been spokespeople for climate action. To the contrary, most of the residents of Tangier contest the idea of human-caused climate change and sea level rise, and think that maybe if it's not quite a hoax, it is a distraction from the real issue of God-made erosion. So to illustrate this, I'm just going to show you this very short clip from a satire news program, Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. So if you can just share that.
Now you see this island here? This wasn't an island. This was all connected. So you can see within a year's time how much land disappeared.
Do you think it's because the sea level was rising?
Nope. It's because of erosion.
A tiny speck in Chesapeake Bay, Tangier is home to a small and very religious community of hardy crabbers. Tangier is rapidly disappearing into the Chesapeake because of sea level rise.
Erosion, not sea level rise.
No, sea level rise caused by global warming.
That's the biggest hoax ever was.
No!
Climate change is real.
No way. I mean, you could never change my mind.
All right, and let me try to get back to, there we go. Let's see if I can hear you now, Anne. Did it work?
Oh, yeah, but I can't see the slide, the next slide.
Ah. I gotta do.
Okay, there we go. So yeah, how can both groups on the front line of sea level rise have such different beliefs in the cause? And so go to the next slide. To illustrate what I mean, I have an interactive activity. And so I guess just post in that questions panel again. What do you see? Who sees blue and black? And who sees gold and white? Let's see if I can. I don't know if I can see the questions there.
Yeah, let's see.
Oh, I see it now, the questions panel. Okay. Okay, so we're seeing a real mix. Gold and white, blue and black, lavender and black, blue and black, gold and white. Yeah, it's kind of, I'd say it's, oh, it's interesting. More gold and white. Usually it's more blue and black. And that actually speaks to something that I'm going to talk about in a second. Quite interesting. Okay, so the next slide. So how is it different? How is it possible that we see different colors? And what's really interesting here about this example of the dress is what's happening that the picture was so overexposed that essentially forces our brains to make assumptions about the lighting conditions in which the photo was taken. So our perceptions of color are informed by our perceptions of lighting. So those of us whose brains assume that that picture was taken under natural lighting, so maybe outside, see it as white and gold. And those whose brains assumed it was taken under artificial lighting, so indoors, see it as blue and black. So the question is, why would our brains assume different lighting conditions? And researchers, neuroscientists, surveyed 13,000 people about the dress and found that the main difference between the blue-black people and the white-gold people was how much time in their life they had spent working inside versus outside. So those who had worked more outside were more likely to see the dress as having been illuminated by natural light, which leads the image to look more yellow. So I see the dress as white and gold, and I spent like a large part of my life actually living outside. So that could help to explain that. So in other words, our brains quite literally see the dress as being a different color based on our prior life experiences. Next slide, please. This process is completely out of our control. For example, even though that I know the actual dress of the color of the dress is blue and black, I see it as white and gold. And there's a book called How Minds Change by David McGraney, and he uses the example of the dress to explain why our tendency to interpret the same information differently is also why we disagree so much, and also why such disagreements often seem to happen across different social identities. For example, across different political ideologies. He says, unaware of the processing that leads to such disagreement, it will feel like a battle over reality itself, over the truth of our own eyes. Disagreements like these often turn into disagreements between groups because people with broadly similar experiences and motivations tend to disambiguate in broadly similar ways. And whether they find one another online or in person, the fact that trusted peers see things their way can feel like all the proof they need. They are right and the other side is wrong, factually, morally, or otherwise. So because of this, information that challenges our pre-existing worldview or our social identities can feel threatening and even offensive. Next slide, please. If we read a weather report, we're unlikely to challenge the science behind that, right? Although sometimes, I don't know if you ever catch yourself checking multiple weather reports to find one that you prefer. I've done that. But if we read a study, for example, pointing to the impacts of a ban on assault rifles, depending on how we feel about an issue, we may be inclined to question those facts if they challenge our pre-existing beliefs. Next slide. So where do our beliefs come from? Well, as the researchers who studied the dress found, beliefs come from our experiences, and these come from our environments, and really our social communities. So our family upbringing, our religion, our interpersonal relationships. These influences shape our most fundamental beliefs about the world without our realizing it. Next slide. Similar to a fish swimming in water, we don't think about the water too much. We think we're the master of our destinies, but we're largely shaped by our environments. And this is often also why we're unaware of, for example, racial, gender, or age-related bias. They exist within our communities and our environments. They're like the water that we're swimming in without noticing how it affects us. Next slide. Sometimes facts can even make things worse. How is this possible? Well, really, they can piss us off. We can sense when someone is trying to persuade us and it generates negative feelings. As in the video, you could see the man getting angry with the reporter for insisting that climate change is real. Information that challenges our pre-existing worldviews triggers negative emotions. The more complex and stressful the information, the more likely it is to be processed in parts of the brain, such as the insula or the amygdala, which is associated with emotions such as fear or pleasure, rather than in the prefrontal cortex, which is associated more with rational thinking and deliberation. And because of this, we actively resist ideas that we disagree with. Next slide. In a 1967 study, for example, so that a lot of the ideas I'm presenting on have been studied over more than a half century. And there were some really interesting studies in the 50s and 60s. So this particular study, researchers had undergraduates listen to some pre-recorded speeches about various controversial topics, smoking, religion, etc. The speeches, however, were full of static and hard to hear. But the participants had the option of pressing on a button to reduce the static if they wanted to get a clearer listen. The researchers found that the students who smoked were very eager to tune in to the speech that suggested the cigarettes may not cause cancer, whereas non-smokers were more likely to slam on the button for the anti-smoking speech. In a similar way, the more frequent churchgoers were happy to let the anti-Christian speech dissolve into static, while the less religious would give the button a few presses. So in other words, we'll make an effort to tune into messages we agree with, but happy to hear those that we dislike. Okay, next slide. So we also might think that more education is the answer, but this has been questioned. In fact, some studies have shown that the more educated people are, the more likely they are to be skeptical of a fact if it goes against their pre-existing beliefs. So for example, studies of smokers in the 1960s found that the most educated smokers were often those most skeptical of the evidence linking cancer and smoking. So why would this be? Well, if you think about it, if you're educated and motivated, you can more easily rationalize arguments to support what you want to think. We like to think we are logical creatures that are always just moving forward based on new information, but we're really not like this. So next slide. So why are we like this? Well, essentially we're evolved to be so. Social bonding is how we thrive as a species, so we tend to adopt beliefs of our community. Also, research has found that while winning an argument triggers feel-good hormones such as dopamine and adrenaline, when our beliefs are threatened, we release cortisol, which is a hormone that's associated with stress and the fight or flight response. Frankly, it feels bad and is risky to go against pre-existing beliefs. Okay, next slide. So back to Tangier. Similar to the dress, the residents also saw things differently. For decades, they'd been trying to raise awareness about the increasing rate of land loss to the sea, and he had even been doing measurements of their own to calculate erosion for more than 50 years, so since the 1950s. They were calculating the loss of land from the ocean long before scientists arrived to talk about climate change. Erosion was the enemy they knew, something they had dealt with their entire lives, that their parents and grandparents had dealt with, and something that could be addressed in the future. Whereas climate change was something from the outside, something that seemed to suggest an end to their island. So you can stop erosion, but not sea level rise. Basically, the islanders were not willing to go down without a fight. And here's a photograph that you can see of a t-shirt you can buy on the island. It reads, "I refuse to be a climate change refugee." Next slide. Furthermore, there was an issue of lack of trust. The residents had a long and frustrating history trying to work with government officials to bring actionable solutions to address the loss of land. As quoted in Earl Swift's ethnography about Tangier, the mayor of the island says, "They do studies and then they study the studies. I know that's their procedure, but it gets frustrating. We're at the point now that it's like me coming across a family in a boat that's sinking, and I say, I'm going to rescue you, but I have to study it first." Next slide. So this gets into the role of trust. Why should we trust scientists and scientific information? So I have another interactive, let's see if it works. So think about the following question. Does the Earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the Earth? So assuming that we're pretty much in agreement here, that the Earth revolves around the sun, just take a minute and think about how you explain how we know this, why we know this. So what is the scientific information we have that demonstrates this, right? And how would you explain this to someone else? So no cheating and looking it up online, but just take a minute, and if anyone wants to try to guess, to think about this and post it. But again, no cheating. I don't know if we have some astrophysicists in the room. The Earth is flat, okay. All right, so I'll just keep moving forward here. Just close this out. Okay. All right, so next slide. So probably most of you found this challenging, unless you have some kind of background in, in astrophysics, astronomy. This is hard, right? We think we know things because we know them, but the truth is that most of the time, we're just relying on the knowledge of others in our communities. We know that the Earth revolves around the sun because of Galileo, but also mainly because of our science teachers in high school, who probably did not do calculations of their own. So most of us wouldn't really know that we need to think about the moons of Jupiter to really understand this. But just that is obvious. Of course, the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. Next slide. The world is extremely complex, so the way we make sense of it is to rely on what our intuition, the world around us, and other people tell us to be true. we're hugely influenced by others in our social networks. This is both the key to our success as a species and also why facts are culturally debated. Next slide. So if facts don't necessarily change minds, then what can work? And so this is the next story here, which comes to us from India. Okay. So next slide. Okay, so polio is a highly infectious viral disease that primarily affects children, and at its peak in the 1950s killed approximately 500,000 people worldwide each year, paralyzing millions more. And as recently as 2009, India was considered the polio epicenter of the world and had half of the world's cases. Many believe that India would never be completely rid of the disease due to a multitude of factors, especially vaccine skepticism, which was concentrated among hard-to-reach groups in underserved parts of the country. Next slide. But incredibly, the last case of polio was identified in India in 2011, and by 2014, the country had completely eradicated the disease. India went from having half of the world's cases to just one case in under 2 years. So how did India go from having just half of the world's cases to just one case in under 2 years? So maybe 2 slides from now. So to understand this, we need to understand something about behavior, how behavior spreads. We often think about how social norms, and so whether, for example, we're talking about the uptakes of vaccines or social behaviors such as recycling, as spreading in the same way that a virus does. But whereas simple information, such as job advertisements, can spread like viruses, researchers have found that this does not apply to complex ideas or calls for behavioral or social change. This is because if someone shares something that is geared towards changing our minds or behaviors, there'll be a degree of resistance that needs to be addressed. And this is where complex contagions apply. Next slide. So complex contagions require social confirmation, which in turn requires 2 intersecting ingredients: direct personal relationships with someone who has already taken on the new belief or behavior, and redundancy. So you have to, for example, hear about the behavior or idea from multiple trusted sources. Okay, next slide. So what does this mean? It means that we need to be people need to hear about the new idea from trusted sources, multiple trusted sources within their own communities. So how can this happen? So next slide. So if we go back to the example of polio, what they did was they engaged volunteers from within vaccine-resistant communities, including nursing students, faith leaders, teachers, to go on a listening campaign and become ambassadors for the vaccine. The volunteers were trained in interpersonal communication skills and tasked with spending time with parents, particularly mothers of small children. They met repeatedly with the parents who were nervous about the vaccine, building trust and rapport through regular visits. For example, it became clear that in the eyes of many poor residents, getting a child vaccinated could mean losing 1 or more days of work if the vaccination caused side effects such as fever. So it became a choice of getting the vaccine or getting daily wages. And it was also, polio was only one health concern, right? And so there were many health concerns. To address this concern, health camps were set up in highly resistant areas, which convened medical personnel and provided free medication and vaccines on days organized in advance with community leaders. This was hugely successful and led to increased trust among the communities and agencies. As described in one article about the process, when talking about healthcare service in urban slums, an interviewee said that it's not a matter of hard to reach, but rather hardly reached. Communities felt ignored by their government and were thus mistrusting or skeptical of government or NGO intervention during polio vaccination rounds. Next slide. So the methods had both ingredients: direct personal communication and redundancy. And perhaps most notable about this achievement is that the interventions had a spillover effect, leading in some high-risk regions of the country to increase in full routine immunization coverage. So for example, in one state, full immunization coverage, so including other vaccines as well, increased from 36% in 2009 to 81% in 2016. Okay, next slide. So what does this mean for communicating science on other topics and encouraging science-based behaviors? Next slide. So here I'll mention the work of sociologist Anthony Giddens, who referred to personal interactions between experts, such as doctors or scientists, and lay people as access points, which he deemed essential for maintaining trust in modern institutions. Beyond just providing information, Giddens argued that such interactions provide opportunities for experts to share values and character traits, so warmth, integrity, professionalism, which are essential for building trust. And this points to an opportunity for members of the scientific community, whether researchers, educators, or communicators, to serve as such access points by connecting in a direct and personal way with people from communities that have been underserved by science. Next slide. Okay, so this brings us to our last story. And this story, like I said, was brought to my attention by farmers in central Pennsylvania in 2021, where I went to do interviews with them about their perceptions of scientists and science. And largely speaking, they were negative about research as being something useful for their farms. But a couple of them mentioned one pair of scientists who were different from others. And these scientists were named John Tooker and Maggie Douglas. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the story is this. Farmers all over the region, especially those who were using no-till or reduced-till farming, were having slug issues. The farmers would talk with one another about possible treatments, call up the county extension offices for help, and go on websites like Ag Talk for advice. But no one seemed to have the answers. And at the time, John Tooker was new to his post at Penn State, and it was a 50% extension position. Soon, Tooker's phone began to ring, and almost every call was about slugs. The farmers invited him to a breakfast and asked for his help, and he said he'd try to help. Although Tooker didn't study slugs, slugs are related more to in the mollusk family and not insects. One thing he did know as an entomologist was that if there was a pest problem, it was likely because something had happened to the pest predators. So based on this theory, Tooker got his student, Maggie Douglas, set up with lab-based experiments, putting slugs in containers with known predators, such as carabid beetles and soybean seedlings, to see what happened. And this is when they made a startling discovery. The beetles were all dying. As it turned out, Douglas had unknowingly planted soybean seed that was coated with a particularly potent insecticide known as a neonicotinoid for her experiments. As Douglas's seed sprouted and grew, the insecticide traveled into the roots and then the leaves of the seedling, and finally into the slug as it ate the plant. While the chemical didn't seem to bother the slugs in the least, it was toxic to its predators, and upwards of 60% of beetles were impaired after eating slugs infused with the pesticide. So Tooker knew they had something important to share with the farmers, and when another field day came up, they had their opportunity. They put together a PowerPoint presentation with the videos embedded in the slides. And Tooker remembered the moment when Douglas played a video of one of her lab experiments, which showed a beetle that was clearly dying from having been poisoned by the pesticide. Yeah, so you could show that, see if it works. So John Tooker said, "I still remember the remarks and gasps in the room of those farmers saying, 'Oh, wow, holy cow.' It was clear evidence that something was messing up those beetles. And once they saw the convincing video, the farmers just took it on faith that our data were related to that phenomenon, that the reason we were finding fewer beetles in the fields was because of that." Next slide. Here I'll mention another key part of the story. The seeds were treated with neonicotinoids, which are the most widely used class of insecticides in the world. Research has found neonicotinoids to be toxic to some pollinator species, and they're banned across Europe, but still continue to be permitted for use in the United States and indeed in some places like Pennsylvania it's hard to find seed that is not treated with these chemicals. For years, there have been significant efforts by environmentalists to get farmers to use fewer pesticides due to their impact on pollinators. But doing so was a tough sell for several reasons. One being that corn is wind pollinated and soybeans are largely self-pollinating. So whether bees were being harmed was not among the top concerns for these types of farmers. But Tooker and Douglas's research findings began to change that. Now planting neonicotinoid-treated seeds was not just bad for bees, it was also potentially bad for corn and soybean crops. But even as the farmers began to understand the problem of using the seed, another problem remained. There were hardly any untreated seeds to be found, and they dominated the corn and soybean markets, and farmers often didn't have a choice of which seeds to buy. Next slide. It was this lack of choice that got the attention of some policymakers, Tooker later told me. After publishing their work in a top journal in the field, they were invited to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with staffers of both the Senate and House agricultural committees. And Tooker and Douglas prepared a one-pager and began talking about the problem of neonics, but they could tell from the onset that staffers were really not that interested. They had heard the story before about pesticides in the environment, and the staffers' eyes really began to glaze over as the researchers attempted to explain the issue. But then Douglas mentioned something about how the farmers didn't have a choice in seed selection, and one of the staffers sat straight up in his chair. They don't have a choice, he said. That's a problem. Next slide. This pointed to a potential opening for change, something that years of lobbying from environmental groups to reduce pesticides by farmers had not had much success with. In 2021, the Natural Resources Conservation Service started offering farmers a small incentive to plant uncoated seed, citing their research as a key motivator for farmers. 8 years later, neonic seeds are still standard for corn and most soybean, but this is actually slowly changing as more non-coated seeds are made available for farmers. States that border Pennsylvania, such as New York, are actually passing laws to ban the use of neonicotinoids, which would drastically change the planting landscape for farmers. So Tooker and Douglas's work has been a part of those conversations, and at some point they're likely to begin happening in Pennsylvania as well. In the meantime, the number of farmers opting for these integrated pest management approaches as opposed to conventional insecticides is growing. And I followed up with some of the farmers I interviewed when I learned more about the story, and some of them told me they had completely switched away from using neonicotinoid treated seeds because of Tooker and Douglas's work. Next slide. So perhaps I'll contradict myself here. Maybe facts can change minds. The farmers, after all, adopted new techniques based on this research. They accepted the facts shown to them. But I like to think about the role of facts as follows. So facts are like the swimming pool that you willingly jump into on a hot summer day in your bathing suit. But if the water's cold or you're not ready to jump in, you'll hop right out. So in a similar way, we must be psychologically and socially prepared for the introduction of facts that may challenge our worldview. Tooker said, if I had come up with those ideas on my own, but been less engaged with the farmers, I don't think it would have had the same outcome because my motivations could have been questioned. Maybe I was anti-insecticide, maybe I was tree hugger. You could come up with a variety of reasons for why they wouldn't trust me, but why they did had a lot to do with the request and our willingness to act on that request. Okay, next slide. So there are 3 things that we can make the fact pool more inviting. The first is that we can make people feel more at ease by listening to them and building relationships. We can be Giddens access points, the flesh and blood connectors to the scientific enterprise. This means starting with the concerns and interests of those we hope to influence with our research. We have to rethink science communication from giving facts to building shared knowledge through trust and dialogue. Next slide. We also need to remember that people learn from others in their social communities. So if we wish to influence a particular community, we need to get to know people in that community and have dialogue in the language that works for them. And if we wish more people to accept science, they need to feel that scientific knowledge is something that makes sense in their own community. Next slide. So to do this, we have to create opportunities for people to have more positive experiences with science. And I took the picture of Julia Bird sent this to me from, I think, an event that had been happening with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. But in many parts of the country, people don't often engage with science beyond high school. So they might not have loved those classroom-based experiences. I know I didn't do too well in science myself in high school. But science can be made more participatory in many ways. So for example, citizen science, mobile laboratories, experiential science education. If people can begin to connect it to have a spillover effect in other arenas, and I would argue this is the main task for those of us who care about science and the environment, to expand who can see themselves to being part of science and environmental communities. Next slide. So this is just an example that was, like I said, I had interviewed Julie for the book, and this was one quote that that I included in the book. And I'll show you a slide of that in a second, but she said, "We realized that it was really important for fishermen to be involved in making the decisions about their fisheries. Things that they were seeing on the water were things that might not necessarily show up in the data yet. And there was just a lot of knowledge there, and also a fair amount of distrust between the people who were managing the fisheries and the people who were actively fishing on the water." So I think this current citizen science program, I'll be interested to learn more from all of you, is an example of how to start creating those kind of access points between scientists and managers and fishermen in a way that I've been talking about here. So next slide. All right, so that's it. Thank you so much, and thanks to also a lot of the folks, Maggie Douglas, John Tooker, and others that helped out with some of the stories that I mentioned in this presentation today. This is just a image of the book that just came out. Technically, it might say it's not out till December, but you can order it now and get it. And here's a 20% off discount code. So thank you all so much, and I'll take any questions if there's time.
Let me pull up just an example of how to operate the webinar real quick again. Many of you have already used the question log, so you can enter your question into the question box. Or if you'd like to ask a question aloud, you can click on the hand-drawn hand. If it's green, it's showing that your hand is down. If it's red, it's raised. And then finally, if you'd like to speak, you've raised your hand, the webinar will notify you when it's your turn to speak. Just click on that red microphone, make sure it turns green, and then we should be able to hear you. So with that, we are welcoming hands raised. So please go ahead and ask your questions of Anne. And thank you for a great presentation, Anne. That was very informative.
Thanks.
So not seeing any hands raised now, so I'll ask a question myself. One of the things that we often run into is having to present fairly new information that we're using to base management decisions on and present it in a kind of a regulatory fashion. So we're telling folks, this is the new information, we have to base management off this. What is the best way to communicate that kind of science in order to get active engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to see more of like the context in which the information is shared as opposed to the specific information. So understanding like how to build relationships with those that you'll share the information with. I mean, for example, if a colleague who I trust is telling me, oh, I just learned this information, like this is really important for this, and I know them and I trust them, I'm like, okay, I'll take that on like immediately. But if I don't know this person and they're telling me something, I'm immediately, well, like, all right, maybe this is useful and maybe it's not. I might forget it, I might resist it. I think it's it's sometimes it's a little bit less about how to, like, sometimes I think there's a lot of focus on how to make the specific content flashy or interesting or share, you know, but I think it's often just like the context of how that, who is sharing the information with who is so important. I do think that there is value in storytelling. I didn't really talk about that, but I, you know, purposefully tried to give this presentation through stories, because giving examples beyond just the facts can often, first of all, it sticks more in our minds. I think because there's some statistic like we're 6 times more likely to remember information if it's shared in the context of a story. So, as opposed to just giving factual information. So giving that example, like, why does this matter, right? It's not just that we need to know the specific thing, but like, why would it matter for this, for shaping management moving forward? And what's an example of that? Maybe like, is there another entity that has put this into place in another context? And then what did that look like? And sharing a little bit more information on that. Yeah, if there's a specific instance, it might be easier to answer the question, though, if that helps.
Okay, thank you. And Heather wrote, thanks, Anne. You had some really great examples. Do you have any recommendations for conveying climate change concepts to a doubting population?
Yeah, so I love this question. I actually ask my students often, I say, okay, you know, I give them a similar lecture and I say, all right, so if your aunt at the dinner table at Thanksgiving is saying climate change, you know, it's not true, it's a hoax. Okay, how would you convince them otherwise? And well, they say all kinds of things. Well, you tell them the facts of sea level rise and all this stuff. And I say, no. First, you should invite your aunt to go to the park with you. Number one, like, get them into a new environment. We don't really change our minds based on, few of us, if we have a certain worldview and that new factual information challenges that worldview, it's very, very, very hard to change minds with more factual information. So there's a couple things that can work. I think one that's really powerful is just creating new experiences for people. So how can we create opportunities for people to, for example, be in a situation where, you know, they might be like at a park cleanup or something, where you'd meet other people that might have, might believe in the facts of climate change. And so they're suddenly like surrounded with a different social community that would also shift their ideas. Telling stories, like I said, is also powerful. There's another example, there's an example in my book, I didn't mention it here, but there's this approach called deep canvassing, which is this door-to-door method of having conversations with people on controversial topics. And so really what happens there is that people share stories with others that they encounter at the door, and they hear from their own stories. So they're kind of having a conversation, and it could be really controversial: transgender rights, immigration, and climate change is an example of some different topics that have been deep canvassed in this way. And the example I give in the book is of this one group in a rural part of Canada, that in a community that most of the people in the community are reliant on a particular extractive industry. So it was fossil fuel-based extractive industry. So it was really just like, it was the lifeblood of the community. And actually, through deep canvassing and having conversations about the concerns about climate change and the importance of renewable energy, the community actually passed I guess a law in their community that they would switch to 100% renewable energy by 2050. And that was done through deep canvassing. So this power of sharing stories, of listening to people, of having these conversations, having these personal interactions. Most people are reasonable. Most people want to, you know, think about things and reflect on them. But just giving people more facts typically doesn't work. It has to be through other lenses. Okay, I see there's another question here.
Yeah, and Before those got typed in, Thomas Newman had raised his hand.
Oh, okay.
Thomas, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, mine kind of follows up on what Chip was asking. Fisheries management isn't an exact science. It's always changing, and individuals are in charge of making these decisions on these councils and whatnot. And everybody's opinion of what we need to do with our fish stocks is different. Some people want nobody to touch the water, completely protect everything. And then we got other people that want to harvest the last fish available. But the thing too with the change in science, I guess, is my main question. We always talk about the best scientific information available. Well, that changes. That changes pretty much every 5 years, and I think that's where you lose a lot of your disconnect with the public and the user groups, is because they don't understand how we could have managed a fishery for decades off of one data stream, and then we completely change that data stream, and then we're asked to completely change our ways and do things differently. And I don't know that you have a good answer for it, but I know there's a lot of people sitting at the state level for North Carolina here and other states, and it's also a big issue on the federal level. I mean, it's just something that we all need to think about, because it is tough when you're when you live on that same island like Tangier. I'm real familiar with Tangier. I've worked in that area, and fishermen are the same way. They don't leave their hometowns very often. They're fishing. Mm-hmm. And you see something, you see how it was, and then all of a sudden it's like your world's flipped upside down. And that's where a lot of these trust issues come in fisheries management. And I don't know if it's a question or me just stating how I feel, but I'm a middleman in a lot of this stuff, and I see the frustrations every day.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really important point. I think it for me, it raises this idea of uncertainty, because often, I think as a researcher, one of the things that is almost foundational to a lot of scientific research is uncertainty, where we never know 100%, right? You shouldn't ever use the word prove in science. But I think there's sometimes there's not that understanding with the public, right? Science is not really taught that great often at the high school level, K through 12. And I think a lot of science teachers don't know how to teach also, like, that there's always some level of uncertainty in any scientific research. And because of this, when there is that, all of a sudden you're confronted, and we saw this a lot during COVID, the uncertainty, the constant uncertainty, mask wearing, don't wear a mask, do wear a mask. Well, things are changing, it was an evolving situation. So the problem is not, and it's not really, I don't know if there's something, an individual level advice that I could give to all of you, but I think as more broadly in how we teach science, how we talk about science, and how we talk about like information that we have that we're basing decisions on, there needs to be this kind of balance between talking about the uncertainty that is always built in as part of the pie, but that we still have to move forward, even if we do have that uncertainty, and that decisions made move forward will be evolving. It's going to be an evolving situation. And that's really challenging. And it can be used, unfortunately, like kind of against people that if we're trying to share scientific information, well, we don't, the limitations, but there have been studies that have shown that if we're upfront about uncertainty and upfront about limitations, and that knowledge is evolving, and people can be involved in those conversations, it can be a powerful way to have conversations about science. So I don't know how helpful that is, but I think it's something that we need to talk about more.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's something that South Atlantic's done recently with the Science and Statistical Committee. They did start talking about uncertainties and these stock assessments and how they're weighing them, and I think that's something we need to do more of. I think that'll build a lot of confidence to know that we can change this, and it's not an exact science. But I know there's a lot of others. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the way you said it. It builds trust. It seems counterintuitive that if we say what we don't know, that we leave ourselves exposed, and maybe bad actors can take advantage of that. But I think most people when you are honest, like sometimes if I make a mistake when I'm talking to my students or something, I tell them, I'm like, oh, I made a mistake. And that builds trust. Like they see that and they're like, oh, you know, like she's being honest with us. And so it builds trust for future and confidence and a feeling of reassurance.
All right, and getting to one of the questions in the question log, I think one of the biggest issues is a numbers game. There are so few scientists and science communicators as compared to recreational fishers in the region. In the India example, they were able to have lots of ambassadors. We don't have that luxury. Any suggestions for that?
Yeah, that's a really great example. So in India, a lot of the folks were volunteers actually. I mean, some were, I think, paid on stipends, and others did get more substantial pay, but there were a lot of volunteers, including students. I think there are a lot of eager people in these, there are a lot of like scientific allies, I guess, or environmental allies. Sometimes though, I think the challenge is that they're so excited that sometimes they might come across in being too, like, let me tell you what the facts are. This is what I know. So I think it's a matter of how can we train eager volunteers to be also those listeners, right? I mean, in India, the folks that went out were trained in conflict resolution and in listening, and there was infrastructure provided. So some of those things can help. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very real challenge for those of us in the scientific and environmental realms where there's just not that much money. It's not as much money as there is in health. But yeah, I think trying to mobilize volunteers could be one way forward. And then I think also it is worth the effort to invest in a small group. So I talked about this a little bit in the second story about how information spreads, but often we think we need to get the information out to as many people as possible. And that's true. But to do that, it's better to kind of focus on a smaller group and then really, really hone in and do quality work with that smaller group. And then through that, then the information can spread in kind of a snowball way. But you need to, instead of diffuse, it needs to be kind of concentrated, if that makes sense. And so if there's a lot of money, it may make sense to focus not on like all of the towns, but like on one town or a select amount of towns. And I know this is really challenging with government funding. It doesn't necessarily lead you to be flexible in this way, but these are some ideas of things that could work.
All right, next we'll go to somebody that had their hand raised. So Nick, you want to unmute yourself?
Hey, Anne. Thanks for the great presentation. I'm Nick Smiley. I'm the Digital Media and Communication Specialist at the Council. My question is kind of a two-part question regarding misinformation. It's something we've been dealing with a lot, and obviously it's a kind of a buzzword, hot topic right now with the growth of social media and AI. But we've been dealing with it a lot recently. I was wondering if you had any insight on if misinformation kind of spreads in the same way as factual information. I guess often it could be more potent because it's maybe malicious or fear-based. And then the second part of that question is, are there tools or ways to intercept misinformation or ways to combat it?
Yeah, so misinformation, any information will spread if there's not resistance to it. So I think it would spread in communities that would not have resistance to it. And we see the politicization, for example, of misinformation, right? That happens really like across multiple topics. In terms of whether we should address it and how, it definitely. There have been some more recent studies that have shown that actually we need to kind of nip it in the bud as much as possible. It's really in any way possible, but one way to do it that can be effective, so often we think about factual debunking. That can work to some extent, but what can be more effective is to have more like process-based debunking. So, and this really typically works better on like a one-on-one level. But if, for example, like you're speaking with someone who's telling you something that you know is misinformation, question them, like, are you certain about that? Like, how certain are you about that? Are you, what is the process through which, not like, why do you believe that? Because that could trigger this idea of like digging deeper into the, well, I believe it because of this, right? And there's distrust in this. And why would we believe that? But if you say, well, how do you know that? Like, how did you come to that conclusion? Understanding a little bit more of the process through which that information, and also so they can kind of see, oh, well, I just saw it online. Okay, well, maybe they'll start to say, well, all right, I just saw it online. Maybe that's not true, right? So it's more of tactical debunking. But if you're talking about like something that's spread out in a meme form and going everywhere, yeah, I mean, we just need to counteract it with however you can, really. It's important to counteract it.
All right, and switching back to a question in the question log, it's clear that interperson interaction is incredibly helpful when trying to build relationships and trust. While council staffs work to get out into the community as much as possible, it's a large area to cover with very limited funds and staff time. Based on your research, do you have any recommendations for building relationships when in-person opportunities may be limited?
Yeah, I think trying to, one thing, well, so in-person opportunities can be limited. I think maybe one way is to think about how to create like maybe community activities, so there could be more people coming to a certain thing at once. Also to get ambassadors for ideas. So maybe I was talking kind of about volunteers, but it could potentially be that like there are people from the communities that you want to reach, and really focusing on supporting those who you feel are already kind of on board with the message, and then seeing, would they feel comfortable and capable and empowered to go out and share the message as well, and what would kind of be in it for them as well, right? Why would they want it? What would be the value for them in sharing that? So I think kind of building a community by focusing on key individuals, maybe seeing what spaces, if there are particular community spaces that might bring more people out. I would say those are maybe hopefully some things that might be doable. It's a little hard to know with I know every budgets are always super stretched, and it's a big challenge to figure out how, but I think it is worth to focus sometimes more on quality than quantity, because sometimes quality can build quantity.
All right, Julia had her hand raised.
Hey, Anne, great presentation. And there's been so many wonderful questions. So thanks for making time to be here for the council seminar. And so I guess this is kind of, my question, I guess, is kind of building on other things that people have touched on and some of your answers have touched on. But I know as we've been doing more outreach work and going into fishing communities, it's become clear that kind of fisheries management is kind of a black box. There are all these different groups that do all these different things, and unless you're kind of embedded in it, it's hard to communicate kind of who's doing what. And then sometimes there are limitations, and kind of the people who are making regulatory decisions, they may be using data that's 2 years old to make a decision, whereas, you know, that what's in that data may not be matching what fishermen are seeing on the water and kind of different issues like that. And so I think sometimes there's different languages too and how we speak. And so it's trying to figure out how to kind of bridge those gaps so that you're talking to people in kind of a similar kind of language, if that's kind of the right word, but also trying to figure out to get, you know, so that everyone has kind of the same information on who's doing what and how the levers kind of work in the system. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I guess my question in all of that is, do you have any suggestions on kind of how we can do those things? And I know you've already given some great ones. It's you know, trying to find ambassadors, working with, you know, smaller groups first and letting information spread that way. But just wanted to see if you had any other kind of thoughts that may help some of those challenges that we have.
Yes, you mean more like interaction between the different people working on different areas? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I think it's worth spending time thinking about social infrastructure and like how to bring people together, because, you know, even if it's not something that's super well, like, you don't have to create a whole seminar series every day, but creating maybe a day to bring maybe all the people that are working on something together for, and it could even just be like a charter a boat, or I don't know if that might be too expensive, but something that would be maybe not that expensive, a relatively easy ask with some food involved and some social interactions, and for people to start talking to each other, because so much can come out of that. I work with nonprofit groups that are interested in how to encourage their volunteers to come back, citizen science volunteers specifically. And one of the recommendations that we found pays the most dividends is to create community infrastructure for citizen scientists. So sometimes it's virtual, like Slack channels and ways they can post pictures, and if they post something on social media, to make sure that someone from the organization likes their post or something. And then often it's like a volunteer celebration event at the end of the season, or just having some like really key people that are very social and ask people to go out for happy hour after they monitor the oyster cages, right? So it doesn't always have to be this like formalized thing. It could just be like finding the people that have the energy and want to do that. And then maybe they're the person that tries to be like, hey, everybody, let's gonna go out, you know, in this particular area for a drink, or we're gonna go and have some pizza together or something after we do the monitoring. And so I think in our modern like system, we're often on these, you know, we don't really see each other in person. Like and it's so important to have those interactions for providing that information flow and reducing, you know, creating that kind of like structure that information doesn't encounter resistance when it's shared.
All right, and going back to a question online, how can we approach communication that builds trust when our audiences are very large and may already be distrusting of information? Further, how do we approach findings, or how do we approach finding those access points within extremely large audiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of goes back to what we've been talking about. You know, I think we can't really just, you know, I'm a little skeptical of, for example, I don't care how good a documentary is, if things need to be told in language and through stories that resonate with the population we're trying to reach. So I think often, I don't think we've done a great job with climate change in that. there's a film that I love to show my students on, it's called Blood on the Mountain. It's about the role of the coal industry in really like the social impacts of the coal industry across Appalachia. And it was largely developed by people from those communities. And it's so powerful to see really, the negative social and ecological impacts the coal industry has had, but it's told through the stories of coal miners and people from West Virginia. And it was specifically developed to reach those audiences. And actually it has some negative footage of environmental activists coming in from the local city and protesting, like putting up signs and doing a little like mini acts of vandalism in the coal extractive areas. And you see this major conflict between the coal miners and the environmentalists that erupts. I think that for me speaks volumes. Like, how can we tell stories about scientific topics, environmental topics, from the perspectives of those who might be otherwise inclined to distrust the information? What are the stories we're missing? There's a science communicator, Simran Sethi, I think her name is, and she tells a story about going to some event on climate change, and there was this man in the crowd who wore a shirt that said something about like climate change is a hoax or whatever. He was sitting right in front of her, and she took a picture of him. And then there was a talk about air pollution and asthma, and the man went up to the speaker afterward, and he was like, my daughter has asthma, and we were like, we don't know, and started he like, it was a very emotional conversation, and she overheard this. There are ways to reach people without talking about like climate change. And I have a colleague who told me that he was doing interviews with farmers in somewhere about climate change, and he found that if they started the conversation by saying this is an interview about climate change, they immediately shut down, say, we don't have anything to say about that, it's political. But if they started the interview saying, have you noticed any changes on the land? Oh yeah, immediately they start talking about changes in climate, everything. So how can we tell story that everyone has stories to share? What are the stories that we can find that there's enough common ground and it doesn't trigger that immediate, this isn't for me, Unfortunately, climate change has become politicized for many reasons, but I will blame Al Gore a little bit in this. I mean, he was like the poster child for climate change and also running for the Democratic ticket. I don't know if there's a better way to make something politicized than do that. And so that's the situation we're in. So how can we talk about changes in climate if they matter and they're important to, the management, in a way that's not going to trigger this distrust and resistance and anger? And then I think you asked about access points. I mean, I think if learning that anyone can be an access point, really, the important thing about redundancy and the idea that, social confirmation can overcome this information resistance is that the more redundancy, so the more people that we hear a certain message from, the more that likely that message will get across. So that is really powerful, because that means that maybe we're just one voice and we don't have to like say it again and again and again to the same person. But if we're like, oh, I believe this is what I believe, that's another person in their network that believes that, and that has that belief and that idea. So in a way, we can be access points ourselves. I mean, it depends on our role, but can be trusted, someone who's trusted who can share that information. But it can't just be one, it can't just be us. We can't be just shoving it down the person's throat again and again. That doesn't work. So we can just see ourselves, oh, I'm one person, this is what I think, this is my story, but that's it. Yeah. I think that was the last question, right?
Well, Tina has her hand raised.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I did want to shift the conversation a bit because I work for an organization that's a coastal organization from Maine through Florida. So we have huge coverage area and we deal with a lot of stakeholders, but we also deal with a lot of media. And there are two species that we get a lot of controversial media around. That's Atlantic menhaden and horseshoe crab. And in particular, there are some reporters who reach out to us with clear biases. Their questions are biased. We give them the same information and try and repackage it each time in a way that'll make them understand or help them understand what we're trying to say. And yet they continue to perpetuate the same storyline and ask us to like affirm that. And we're like, no, that's not how it is. So, you know, it makes us want to just like shut that reporter out. I know that's not helpful either. He's a New York Times reporter. Do you have any feedback on how to deal with clearly biased reporters in getting your information out in a clear and factual way?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it might not be possible, but probably my first thing to do would be to invite them to come out on a boat and meet folks in person. If there's that in-person connection, it can change perception very, very strongly. And it can make people more receptive. It can help if there's any way to create an experiential opportunity for the reporter to see the information. And this again might not be possible, but to open that up and like, hey, we'd love to talk to you. Is there any way we can like bring you out? You know, could you come out, or could we have, maybe if you said they're New York Times, they might be based in New York. Maybe, I mean, menhaden and horseshoe crab are also here. Maybe there's some colleague that could do something more local if it wouldn't be a possibility for them to go out. But just to have that opportunity and invitation might in itself be create a different dialogue. I don't know, it's worth a try. Because yeah, like you said, if you're just giving the same information and they're just clearly not absorbing it, something needs to shift. So, or inviting them to, I don't know, something, or maybe a Zoom conversation between all of you, but ideally it would be something more in person if possible.
Thank you.
That's all the questions.
I think that's all the questions. You've done a great job presenting the information and also answering a variety of questions. So we really appreciate all the time that you've given to this, given to us today, and also to this topic. I think it's very important as we're trying to get out there, and you know, there's so much information out there, and learning how to communicate it best, I think, is going to be extremely helpful for us, helpful to us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thanks again for inviting me, and yeah, happy to share my contact information if anyone wants to get in touch.
Okay. And then we don't have our seminar series next month because we'll be having our council meeting, but January, I think it's January 14th, will be our next seminar series, and it will be given by Steve Cadron talking about stock structure. So with that, thank you everyone for attending. And if you have any questions.
Someone asked if the meeting would be recorded, and yes,
it is,
right.
Yes, Jenny, it is being recorded, and it's going to be posted hopefully by Friday on our webpage.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.